Good afternoon, or good evening, I should say, everybody. Hope you've had a lovely day out in the sun and appreciate you coming along to this webinar while the sun is still shining. Sculpting the creek, as we say in Gaelic, splitting the rocks, as we say in English as well. Thank you very much for coming along. The format for this evening, over the next hour or so, we're going to be looking at a series of slides from me that I've prepared, a bit of a crash course in Gaelic history and Gaelic awareness, Gaelic contextualisation, with an emphasis on place names. And then ideally we will leave half an hour, which seems like quite a long time, but I think we'll use it up quite well. We're going to leave half an hour for a bit of chat amongst us on the Q&A mainly, and any questions that you have, questions you might have already in this world, this sort of area of interest, or questions that come up as we're chatting, because I'm sure I'll mention certain place names or areas of interest that are relevant to yourselves. So either keep those questions to yourselves until then, or just chuck them in the Q&A, and we'll do our best during the breaks and at that session at the end to get through them all as best as we possibly can, because we really want this to be as interactive as possible. So that's an hour from me and then half an hour hopefully led by you and your area of interest. But the interactive section I really want to actually begin just now is by asking you all, if you have it in front of you, the Q&A section, the bit where you can add your questions in. I would love it if everyone that's here can put in their answer to the question, where is home for you? That could be where you're phoning in from, where you're on the call from, where you were born or brought up, or just somewhere very, very special to you. I want to know where home is. You'll have guessed the reason I'm asking this is because we're going to be talking a lot about place names, Gaelic place names primarily, but lots of different place names. And no matter where you are in the world, you can find a really interesting, you can discover a lot about a place and a person with just looking at the place names. And I can see some answers are coming in already, so that's great. Thank you to those of you that are doing that. So that's your first wee thing to think about. Without further ado, I'll get the presentation going, and I should say this will be fairly informal. Well, not informal, but I'm not a strict teacher. If you need to run away to go and open the door or get a bite to eat or a cup of tea or whatever it is, feel free to do that. Rather you did that rather than sitting uncomfortable, impatient, desperate to run to the toilet and you're missing out on some of the session. So don't worry too much about that. So yes, without further ado, let me get this started. Hopefully you're all seeing this presentation. I can see Kathy. Can you see it there? Yeah, fantastic. So, fáilte uirse a chartain ge inimeolalas, Gaelic name knowledge with me, Russ Christie, looking specifically at Park Náisiúnta, Loch Lomond is in Trossachs, Loch Lomond in the Trossachs National Park. But as you'll see here, all of the stuff we're going to look at also is really relevant in the wider Scottish context, and in fact in the international context as well, as you'll find out as we go along. So yeah, as we start, feel free, just chuck any questions, any comments in that chat, and we will get a chance to look at it as we go along. So the aims of this session, amicimentation, these are the four main things I'd really love we got out of it today. So taich, meaning support. So I want to provide support to you in developing your ability to engage with the Gaelic language. Engage is a lovely buzzwordy word, but what it means is however you want to use Gaelic, whether that means this is the beginning and end of it and you'll never get involved with it whatsoever, that's fine. Or whether it means you're going to start off on Duolingo and then you might end up becoming fluent and then a big Gaelic academic, who knows? I want to support you at the beginning of that journey. Space, respect. I want to foster an understanding and a demonstration of respect for the Gaelic language landscape and its speakers. Gaelic speakers and the Gaelic language community is inherently a minoritized community. It's generally a fairly privileged, predominantly white community. However, it also does suffer from soft discrimination at times in the Scottish cultural context. So I want to foster a bit more respect towards that amongst people. Cohexa, context. Want to provide a bit of context for the Gaelic language. That's a real main thing here, and place names are a great vehicle to do that. So to contextualize the Gaelic language for our uses and gain new insights, new understandings through the language. And finally, I'm saying all of these are the most important. They're all equally important. GLIP, legacy. So to equip you with the know-how to further your own understanding and where to find more info. Your Gaelic journey, your engagement with Gaelic cannot begin and end with this session. An hour and a half is plenty of time to really get to know a lot of this stuff, but not to really, really continue to develop your learning. If you want to engage with the language further, more time needs to be spent. I won't be able to answer every single little amazing rabbit hole question that we have about place names, but I'm hopefully going to point you to the resources and to give you the ability, the linguistic ability, to begin to learn for yourselves as well after the fact. So those are the aims for the session. Hopefully that's what you were expecting and you've not clicked on the wrong webinar link and you're expecting something completely different from me. Either way, stick around. You'll enjoy it, I hope. So bringing up this screen may have elicited some groans from some people because you're looking at maps and AD following numbers, which means we're looking at history. History might not be everyone's bag, but bear with me. It's really, really vital, I find, for discussing this topic. I'm not a historian. I'm not formally, professionally trained in history in any way, as you will probably find out with my very approximate dates as to when particular things happened. So people can keep me right in the chat, but also know that the dates and times and maps and things we're looking at here are fairly rough and broad. It's just to give us a bit of an idea of the past 2,000 years of history. So why are we talking about 2,000 years of history? Well, we can go back to 0 AD and essentially the centuries before then to talk about the Celts. These people that we've all heard about, the Celts, the mysterious Celts. They're not that mysterious. We know quite a lot about them. They're a very, very diverse people group, genetic group that originated in Indo-Europe, so Eastern Europe, and moving towards Eurasia in a few centuries BC. Through those centuries, they then began to move through Europe, and they spent a bit of time in the Iberian Peninsula, so what is today Spain and Portugal, before eventually being sort of pushed and ending up on the very western fringes of the European continent. And that is what we know today as the British Isles and a section of France, as we can see today. Now, these Celts, they had somewhat of a shared language. There's probably a lot of variation amongst it, and language changes over centuries, but we can consider them to have a shared Celtic language. That's a simplification of it, these people. Once they end up settling in a place for a while, though, and I say they, meaning anyone, any people group, generally the language changes. It splits and it develops to suit the particular cultural needs and the particular kind of idiosyncrasies of the community, depending on where they are. And we see this in any language. Think about the regional languages, the regional accents of English. You get a very different variation of English in Liverpool as you do from Newcastle, as you do from Edinburgh, as you do from Stornoway. So this happens in many languages. But it's really extreme example we see here with Celtic. So the Celtic language, once the people have settled, it splits into two main branches initially, a northern branch and a southern branch. That northern branch we refer to as the Q Celtic languages, and the Q Celtic languages that are spoken today are highlighted on this map as Scottish Gaelic, Manx Gaelic, and Irish, or Irish Gaelic. And then the southern branch, which we refer to in linguistics as P Celtic languages, are Welsh, Cornish, and Breton in Brittany in France. These are the 6 Celtic languages that are still spoken today. There were other Celtic languages. One fairly recent example, well, I say recent, is Cumbric. Cumbric was essentially the last Celtic language to entirely die out and is not being revitalized. And it was spoken in Cumbria, as the name suggests. And it's still actually spoken to an extent by some rural hill sheep farmers. They have a unique way of counting sheep, and it's based on the old Cumbric language, but it's not spoken at all as a language anymore. So these 6 Celtic languages in the different colours here, these are the ones that are still spoken today. And we have the Q Celtic one and the P Celtic one. So these two branches eventually over time also split into their own individual languages that are all slightly different from each other. So this is the shape of what we're looking at. We have these two branches around about 0 AD. The centuries between then and 500 AD is where things begin to split and get a little bit more complicated. But we are homing in on Scotland here. These blobs I've added on the map, in linguistics we call them isoglosses. You'll be well familiar with isobars from watching the weather map. And right now we're really lucky. All of our isobars are all nice and close together because we've got nice high pressure. And so the isobars show you the weather moving. Isoglosses, gloss being the Greek for tongue, means that shows where languages are and move, or essentially the people that speak those languages. And again, it's more complicated than this. It's much more fluid than this, even at 500 AD. But this gives you a rough idea of the key languages at play. So most of these languages here are Celtic languages, except for the ones spoken by the Angles here. So the big isogloss here I've got is the Gaelic or Gaelic language. People often get hung up on whether we call it Gaelic or Gaelic or what have you. In Scotland, for the past however many, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years, we've known it as Gaelic in English. If you were to say Gaelic, that's fine. Some dialects say Gaelic, but generally we say Gaelic to differentiate from the Gaelic culture of Ireland, such as the Gaelic Games, the GAA, the Irish kind of sports association. So in Scotland, we're speaking Gaelic. But this sort of shared group of Gaels, they actually migrated into Scotland from the north of the island of Ireland around about this time. And they've been going back and forth for centuries. For those of you that have been down to Kintyre or to Ballycastle in Northern Ireland, you know it's only 12 miles, the narrowest point there. So for a seafaring people, which the Celts were, or the Gaels were in particular, that really is no distance at all. So these were not two separate entities. These were very much connected. But it's around about 500 AD, the 6th century, that we see people really moving in numbers from the north of Ireland, a kingdom called Dalriata, moving into the west coast of Scotland. And as they settle the west coast of Scotland more and more and more, they move up all the way through the west, all the way further north and east, and into the central belt as well. So these are the Gaels really beginning to have real significant power. At the same time, though, the Picts in the northeast, they previously would have had a lot more ground, essentially, a lot more territory. These were people that spoke a Celtic language as well. It's thought that Pictish was probably a P-Celtic language, which is, this wider Welsh group of languages. So the Pictish language may be similar to Welsh. We see that, again, a little hint of what we're going to talk about in place names. So you get Aberdeen and you get Abergavenny and Aberystwyth. So Aber, that's a great old Pictish language element there that shows that there was a shared linguistic continuum all the way from the northeast of Scotland down to Wales. But at this time, the time we're looking at, the 6th century, the Gaels are beginning to push into the Pictish territory and essentially overtake that ground. In the south of the country, we have the Britons, for whom the island eventually becomes known. And for anyone that's seen Monty Python and the Holy Grail, that's who King Arthur claims to be king of. He's king of the Britons. That's these people that he's talking about. And they had the heart of their kingdom was Alt Clogher, essentially Dumbarton Rock. You'd be familiar with the fact there's a castle there. It's the longest inhabited fortification in the British Isles, I think, going back all the way to the time of the Britons there. So the northern regions of their kingdom was essentially around about Dumbartonshire. Then on the east coast, we have the Angles coming in. So these are a Germanic tribe, the Angles giving us eventually the name English. So these are a sort of burgeoning, more significant tribe who we'll see a lot more from as we go through the centuries. Okay, Bog getting a little bit more complicated, because by the time we get to, I think, 793 was when the first Vikings landed on Lindisfarne. That's the first record we have of them landing. Keep me right if I've not got my dates quite right. We have Viking invaders, or Norse, or the Scandinavians, essentially. And they arrive in, and they have really significant influence all down the western seaboard. As far south as Kintyre and Islay as well, and Arran, I'm sure. But their real big linguistic stronghold and cultural stronghold is in the Western Isles, the north of Scotland, and the Northern Isles. As we all know full well, places like Orkney and Shetland have a really strong affinity with this sort of Norse Scandinavian culture due to the fact that it was only a few centuries ago that tie was really fully broken officially. But they're coming in and they're bringing their own different language. But simultaneously, the Gaelic force, this Gaelic isogloss is growing and growing and growing to the extent that it practically eventually covers the entirety of the country. So I would argue that there's not a section of mainland Scotland or the Hebrides that hasn't been touched by Gaelic in some way. You will find evidence of Gaelic place names there kind of everywhere. Shetland is one where I don't believe there is any evidence at all. Orkney, probably very little evidence as well of much Gaelic there, although there would have been communication with Gaelic speakers. But we can find evidence of that all across the country. You'll see I've changed as well as the Angles with Angles and Danes. So these are Danish Vikings coming in from the east and settling and bringing in their linguistic influence into the north of England as well, which we'll probably come back to. So this is the most complicated it gets. These are all of the people that are at play in Scotland. And this helps to demonstrate to us all of these little blobs, they've all got their own languages, and they've all got their own influences. So when we talk about Scotland's linguistic history, it's not just a case of English and Scots and Gaelic. It's English and Scots and Gaelic and Pictish and Norse and Brythonic and Cumbric, and all of these languages is much more complicated. And if you were to look at the languages today, we've got even more languages in play in Scotland as well. So it's a very, very complicated picture. But a big significant one of this time is, of course, the Gaelic language. But this big green Gaelic blob, this is it beginning to be at its height, essentially. By the time we reach the 11th century, that is the high water mark for Gaelic, essentially, because the following 1,000 years are really years of decline, but still really, really interesting. So the high water mark comes when Scottish King David marries an English Queen, Margaret, and she brings her Anglo-Saxon bureaucracy up into Scotland, and she establishes the first royal boroughs and these market towns, and essentially helps to establish English as the language of commerce. So that's what these pink isoglosses here are. This is the English language gaining influence, and at the same time, Scots is developing as well into the sort of old Germanic languages. So English is gaining ground amongst all of these people, because if you want to trade, if you want to make your money with the rest of the British Isles, English is the language of money at this point. So the following 1,000 years, which I'm actually going to skip over a little bit, we'll look at them slightly. These are 1,000 years of decline. So from the 11th century to where we are today, the general trend is of language decline. Starting here. Despite this, the Lordship of the Isles, which is kind of the last independent Gaelic or Gaelic kingdom, it flourishes for a further 300, 400 years until it is eventually waned and brought into power of greater Scotland as one big entity. But it continues for a good few centuries as a really amazing, interesting, highly cultured Gaelic kingdom. And they're really mainly on the western seaboard here. But all of these languages, even this complicated picture we saw here, and this less complicated picture here, as these isoglosses sort of retreat and change and disappear and decline, you can almost think about it like a retreating tide. So although there was a high tide, as the tide retreats, it leaves a big line of seaweed called the Túr in Gaelic. There's a line of seaweed on the beach. And that's what we can think of place names as being like. So although the language goes and the amount of people that are speaking the language go, they leave their mark in the shape of place names. So that's what we're really going to be looking at today. But these 1,000 years, a quick look at that. And we're not going to go over it. It's been hugely interesting. We could spend another 300 webinars talking about that. But while we're here, I would recommend looking at these books here. First and foremost, The Warriors of the Word, this top book on the top left. Even just the first chapter of that will give you a fantastic overview of all of the stuff we've talked about today so far, with more accuracy, with sources and dates than I've got. But it's a really great introduction to Gaelic Scotland. The other books here too by James Hunter, Dance Called America and Glencoe and the Indians, really great, focusing on the period around the clearances and essentially finishing the story of the clearances as to what happened once the boats left Scotland and once they arrived in the so-called New World. And then the two books on the bottom are great on Gaelic in the 20th and 21st century. Gaelic in Scotland by Wilson MacLeod's a great, great read if you're really, really into this sort of thing and you can understand the shape of policy today. But a little look at where we are today. I mean, it's a really different picture from where it was even 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 40, 50, 60. The tide is beginning to turn, this tide that I was talking about. So all of these little yellow dots I've got marked on the map, you can guess in your head what these might mark. These roughly mark places where there's Gaelic medium schooling across Scotland. So as you can see, it's not an islands thing. It's not Highlands and Islands thing. It's all across the country. In particular, in the central belt, Glasgow Gaelic School, which is pictured on the bottom left here, that's absolutely bursting at its seams. And I think they're building a fourth or fifth Gaelic school in Glasgow, two in Edinburgh, and the rest all across the rest of the Highlands as well. So we've got Gaelic medium schooling, which is an amazing development considering the fact that we've seen thousands of years of decline. We've got a national TV channel with international media and multi-million-pound dramas coming out of it. We've got a great, thriving online social media scene. These two ladies here in the green box, these are the Big Gales from the podcast Big Gales Don't Cry, which is well worth listening to. And then in the middle, on the bottom there, you see a sunny day, just like it was today. That's myself with a group of young people walking on some hills in the northwest a few years ago, part of the kind of Gaelic youth work in formal education sector, which is which is doing really well. Not quite as big as formal education, but it's on its way towards that. So what I'm trying to show you with this is that Gaelic is in a very, very different place from where it was even 30 years ago, essentially, even when I was born. It's in a really, really different place. And for the first time, we're seeing census figures finally climb after reaching a low of about 50,000 at the end of last century. And now we're climbing up towards 70,000. So we're in a really positive trajectory. But that's not what we're going to be talking about today, because we want to get back to this idea of the place names. So here's a great example of what happens when we have all these different people groups, all these different isoglosses that I was talking about, all shifting in amongst each other, coming after each other and what have you. We get a place name like this. This lovely waterfall is up on the northwest of Mull, and in fact, I'm going to be going and visiting there tomorrow, and if it's still sunny, I'll be going for a dip in there, in the S-Forest waterfall. Now, S-Forest waterfall is a triple tautology of a name, which is a fancy way of saying it says the same thing 3 times over in 3 different languages. And the great thing is the order of these languages tell us exactly who was living there and when and why they named it. So S is the Gaelic word for a waterfall. That's what we would use today. If I saw a waterfall, I'd say it's an S. Then in blue, we have the Norse word for a waterfall, Fors or Foss. If anyone's visited Iceland, I think the really famous one that you see on Instagram is the Skogafoss. That's that word, that's waterfall. And in the north of England as well, where the Danish influence is, they have High Force waterfall, and that's their tallest waterfall. And force is that word, force. Then finally, you have the English word, which we all know, waterfall, because it's English speakers that came in after Norse speakers, after Gaelic speakers. So you ended up with the S-Force waterfall. And in the name, it tells you exactly the linguistic history of Mull in a nutshell. So that's exactly the sort of thing we're going to try and kind of crack, the nut we're going to crack when we're looking at Gaelic place names. So it's not just a case of translating the Gaelic, but it tells us so much about who was there and why and when. And it connects us to a Viking that travelled from Scandinavia hundreds and hundreds of years ago and when they met a Gael. So that's what we're going to be looking at when it comes to these place names. So yeah, what does that mean for us here in the area surrounding Loch Lomond and the Trossachs National Park? We're looking again at this wee excerpt of the map. You remember the big green isogloss, which is a bit rough. But generally, the most significant language that's at play in the national park is, of course, Gaelic, because that's where the Gaelic sphere of influence is. But what's particularly really interesting about the park here is actually the park boundary butts up against a really significant English language sphere of influence, or English and Scots, which is the Central Belt and south of Scotland. So we see some really interesting mixes that we'll talk about later as we go through the session. There's a couple of good questions that have come up already, and I think I'll answer a couple of them just to clarify. So, Kate, you were asking a couple of questions about double tautologies. Yes, both the examples you gave were spot on. If other people can't see the chat, Kate was asking about a place called Callow Harbour down in Loch Ridden, down in Cowell. Callow Harbour and Clachan Village, which I think is near Stracher, if not in Stracher. Those are 2 examples of tautologies of 2 languages. So Callow is a word for harbour, and so Callow Harbour is harbour in Gaelic and English. And then Clachan Village, yeah, Clachan is it's a sort of, is synecdoche the right word? I'm trying to think back to higher English. I think Clachan was a sort of colloquial term people would use to describe their village, because Clachan literally means stones, almost like and so I think when people call their village Clachan, it's almost like the pile of stones, the pile of rubble, in a sort of self-deprecating way, because that's what houses are, is they're stacked stones. So Clachan, yeah, a small little Highland village, Clachan village. How do we know, so Saracha was asking, how do we know when languages spread? Is it from the place names, or is there other indication of language and time that inform the isogloss? So the 2 answers are generally, and I'm not a pre-historian, well, I'm not a historian either, and I'm not an archaeologist, but before we have kind of proper good written sources, the answer is from archaeological evidence. So certain people had certain practices that they had. But from essentially the Christianization of the Celtic world, by that point we then had monks who were able to write down and tell stories. When I say stories, I mean histories as well. So the idea of who came when and where and what happened. That's why things around the idea of what happened to the Picts is so uncertain, because the whole thing about history being written by the winner, whether there was a winner, whether it was a battle, or whether essentially they were I don't like the phrase bred out, that's not a great phrase, but whether that's essentially what happened, they intermingled with the potentially more dominant Gaels. Beyond that, we can essentially just look. Place names is a really good indicator, and we can see how a language develops as well. So we have the same place names in Scotland and Ireland, but in Gaelic or in Gaelic, or in Irish and in Gaelic, but just the way they're spelled indicates that certain the people that moved to that place in Scotland were from a particular place in Ireland, where we know a particular dialect uses that particular type of word. Beyond that, the actual answers as to why and where people spread and how we know, I'm afraid you would have to ask an actual historian beyond me what the actual evidence we have for that is, beyond archaeological and place name evidence, and the religious texts that we have, such as it came through the monasteries from the 5th, 6th centuries onwards. Anne asked, where does Scots and Doric fit into the history you've outlined? Yeah, are the dialects of English or languages in their own right? As far as I know, and I think the general prevailing understanding is they are languages in their own right, because they did not develop from English. They developed at the same time as English developed from a mix of languages. So English developed from a mix of the languages being spoken by the Angles, by the Saxons, by Danes, by Normans, and English kind of developed into the English we know today at the same time. And Scots was doing the exact same thing, but just further north in the British Isles, with influence from Gaelic and influence from Norse and influence from the other languages they were meeting with. So as far as I'm concerned, it is, but I'm not an expert on Scots. Andy has asked, Dasher near Aberfoyle on old maps West Perthshire, any ideas what it might be an anglicisation of? Off the top of my head, I haven't got a clue, I'm afraid. Asher is a Norse word meaning pass, so it could be something to do with that, but the likelihood of the Norse getting as far as Aberfoyle is less likely. So I'm not sure, but I've got my place name book and I'll look into it when we do the session at the end, because I imagine I'll be looking into it. And if I don't answer you, you can get in touch with me via email. What does inch mean? Like inch Kailach? Well, Ellie, you've given me a lovely transition into the next section of the chat, if everyone's ready for it. So we're going to look over, I think, about 20 or so really common landscape features, including inch. Don't worry, we will come to it, Ellie. They appear a lot of the time, and particularly in the park, but also elsewhere. And all of these are rooted, as far as I can tell, in Gaelic. So the first one here, and feel free to say these out loud after me. I don't know where you all are. You might be sitting with the family and they might think you're going mad with your headphones on saying words they don't recognise, but it's a good way to get your mouth kind of round the sounds and shape of Gaelic. So the first word, a nice easy one, is bine. Bine. Like pine, like a pine tree. Bine. So this literally means a mountain or hill. Generally, our highest hills tend to be called bine. So the majority of the Munros are called bine something, as opposed to having a different type of hill name. So bine, generally higher hills, but they can be smaller ones as well. So bine, a mountain or hill. And the bine I've chosen here is just east of Firkin Point on Loch Lomond. Bine Vreich. Bine Vreich. Breich, B-R-E-A-C, we'll look at that word. It means kind of speckled or dappled. So Bine Vreich, the speckled or dappled mountain or hill. Meow. Meow. A lump. We've got lots of these in our Gael where I am, whatever's going on with the geology south of us. We don't have high mountains, but we do have lots of meowing. Meow. So imagine this like a cat's meow, but with a big fat L at the end of it. Meow. Meow. So the one that we've got here on the page is Meow Ganavich, just north of Benan. Not sure whether anyone's walked on this, but if you have, I would be intrigued to know, because Meow Ganavich means the sandy lump, the lump of sand. Ganavach, the word for sand. The beach near me in Oban is called Ganavan. It's Ganavach, Ganavich. So the sandy lump. I wonder whether, again, I'm not a geologist, I don't know whether perhaps there's some sandstone or mudstone or some sort of brittle stone here that's meaning the lump is quite sandy. And beside it is an interesting place name, not the most descriptive, Lochen na Ní. You might be able to see that on the map. Lochen na Ní, the little loch of the things. That's what a knee is. It's a thing. So it's not a very helpful place name, but evidently to someone it was useful at some point. Lochan, the knee. So that word that's again common in our Monroe names and in our Corbett names is meow. Meow. Carn. Carn. This is quite an easy one because it's essentially just how it's written to an English-speaking pair of eyes. Carn, a rocky hill, a rocky stack of some sort. And it gives us the English word cairn. It's the English word cairn that is used all over the world. The city of cairns in Australia, for example, and navigational cairns that you get wherever you're walking and trekking comes from the Gaelic word carn. And when we see it on a map, it's a pretty, we can be pretty confident that the summit is going to be a rough, rocky pile of some sort. So I would assume, having not been on Cairnglass here on the east side of Loch Lomond, that the summit of that is an exposed sort of boulder field. If you think about if anyone's been up to Cairngorm, up on the funicular, up to the summit of Cairngorm, that is in Cairngorm, and that is a completely exposed rocky boulder field. It's a stack of rocks. So that's what you can think of when you see Cairn. It's Cairn. Bialoch. Bialoch. This is a great one. And someone has been talking about this recently on social media. If anyone follows the Speak Gaelic social media accounts, which I'll probably get a chance to chat about at the end, they were talking about this place name recently. So Bialoch is a path, a mountain pass, or when we see it in mountains, people often describe it as a saddle or a col, but it's not. You're in Scotland, so it's a Bialoch. It's not a lake, it's a loch. It's not a col, it's a Bialoch. So this is it. No one here has any excuses now to be saying Bilac or Bilach or Bialoch. It's Bialoch. Just how it's written, as far as I'm concerned. Bialoch. Bialoch. And the reason I've chosen Baloch here on the map is because, well, you can probably see that's where we get the name Baloch from. It's an anglicisation of Bialoch. Now, Baloch is considered a Bialoch. It's considered a pass for a couple of reasons, I think. So you've got hills to the east and west of it. You've got Ben Bowie and Kilpatrick Hills kind of on either side of it. And it is the low point where Loch Leven, where the River Leven flows out of Loch Lomond. But I think more symbolically, Baloch was seen as a passing point from the highlands into the lowlands because it lies right on the highland boundary fault. So that's where the terrain really changes in Scotland from highland to lowland terrain. So for Highlanders, drovers back in the day, travelling down to the central belt for stock fairs and what have you, reaching Baloch would have been seen as a sort of passing point into easier terrain and into the lowlands. So that's why Baloch is the Bialoch. And it's different to the Baloch near Inverness. It's spelled exactly the same as Baloch, but that's actually a different word. That's Balaloch, which means kind of loch village, Balaloch. So there's Baloch and there's Baloch, depending on where you're talking about in Scotland. Okay, the next word is corre. 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 We often see this now. The English version of this is corrie, and that's become a very much an accepted part of kind of geographical terms. And people talking about mountaineering in Scotland, they talk about the corrie. The equivalent in Welsh is the coombe. I think it's CWM. So corre, meaning a corrie, literally a glacial bowl, a scoop out of a mountain that's been carved out by a glacier. And I say bowl because it's something that could potentially hold water, potentially hold liquid, and that relates to the original meaning of the word corre, which is sort of cauldron or a big pot. So a witch's cauldron would be a corre. And that's developed now so that we have the kind of everyday usage of corre is for your kettle. So the thing that you boil water in. So if I say to someone, curry and curry, I stick the kettle on. I'm actually saying stick the cauldron on to boil, which is quite nice. I like calling back to that old archaic word. But I've chosen this corre here on the side of Ben Lomond, corre Ivahi, because it really caught my eye. We've got 1,000 different corries all across Scotland, but this one's nice because Bach, which is the word here in that name, Bach is a byre, like B-Y-R-E, like a barn that you would keep livestock in. So this is corre Ivahi, the corrie of the byre. And it's really interesting to me that this side of Loch Lomond is Ben Lomond is probably not often frequented. I can't imagine people often leave the path. And going down what's east of Lomond, sort of down into the Trossachs area and to all those lochs. That's pretty close to what we might want to consider a wilderness or quite wild, untouched land. Well, untouched, quote unquote, no paths, not often frequented. But we've got evidence here, we have linguistic evidence that at one point this was farmed, this was worked, this had human industry in it, this had, farming activity. And we have that through the place name. So I like when we come across place names like this because it helps to sort of dispel the myth that there are wildernesses in Scotland. That's quite contentious, but people often talk about places like Knoydart as being the last true wilderness in Scotland. But you can go to a map of Knoydart and you can find there's a place somewhere in Knoydart called Crake and Talia, which is the crag of the tailor, as in like a clothes tailor. And it's a fairly sophisticated wilderness that has a clothes tailor. So it just shows that through the centuries and through the changing of that landscape, the fact that it's been depeopled, that we now see it as wild. That's not always the case, particularly if you've got a Gaelic speaking set of eyes, if that phrase makes sense. You can see that, in fact, no, this is not a wild part of the world. This once had a sophisticated community in it. They're just not there anymore. So anyway, that's a long tangent to talk about Corra Ivahi. But Corra, really common word. Corra, if you say Corrie when you're out in the hills, that's fine, because it's come to be an established part of the terminology now. But Corra. Oh, gone the wrong way, sorry. Alt. A stream. It's quite a difficult one to get over a microphone because you can't hear the big thick L. But essentially, it's like alt, A-L-T, but that double L is giving us a big thick. Make your tongue as big as you can and go alt, O, alt. If you were just to say alt, no one would correct your Gaelic out on the hill. Don't worry. But that's that word, alt, just meaning a stream. I was intrigued. This is a great example of the national park area kind of butting up into an English and Scots language sphere of influence. There's actually the alt wasn't as common as I thought it was going to be in the south of the park. It was much more common to find the word burn, which is the kind of Scots everyday word that a lot of us would use for a burn, for a stream. But even though that's a Scots word, as I was saying earlier, Scots takes a lot of its, well, not a lot, but some of its stuff from Gaelic, and burn is a great example of that because the Scots word burn comes from the Gaelic word burn, meaning drinking water, fresh water. And that's the word they still use in Lewis for drinking water. As far as they're concerned, ushke falls out the sky, burn comes out the tap, or comes out of a drinking water stream or something like that. Whereas everyone else in Scotland just says ushke for all the same thing. It's all water. So that word is alt. Alt. On to, remind me, I think it was it Ellie asked the question about inch. And just like that, I've given you the exact one you asked about. If this was preordained, promise you it wasn't. But it's an interesting one. So the word we're looking at here is not actually inch, but we'll come on to that. It's cailleach. 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 Again, that big fat L. And it means old woman. And a lot of recent writings, which in a really great way are attempting to engage with Gaelic, they've talked about the Cailleach, who is the sort of mother goddess of Celtic Gaelic belief, one of the goddesses of Gaelic Celtic belief. And they often describe her as the hag. Now, not all old women are hags. That's the point I want to make in this, is that the word Cailleach is used just to mean any old woman. I would call my mother or my auntie or my granny the Cailleach. It just so happens that the goddess we have, who is called the Cailleach, she is a bit of a nightmare. So she is referred to as the hag, or as a hag often. But the word Cailleach literally means an old woman. And in the case of Inch Cailleach, it's actually not referring to an old woman necessarily, but to women. Inch Cailleach. And the women it's referring to are the nuns. So I was reliably informed that there used to be a nunnery on this island, or there are the remains of a nunnery. And the Gaelic for a nun is a Cailleach. It literally translates to black woman, but what that refers to is, of course, the black habit that the nuns wear. So the dark woman is Cailleach Dua. So Ish Cailleach, Inch, you've probably worked out, means island, because that's the islands that we've got all across Loch Lomond. But Ish is a great, very original sort of Q Celtic Gaelic word for island, whereas Eilean, which is the modern day word we use, and that's the one you see on the west coast a lot of the time, Eilean and Ron or Eilean Tarasai or whatever it's going to be. Eilean, that's an import. I think that's sort of Norman origin or Norse. But it's similar. You see it in Eglon or Elon. You see that in different languages. It's the same. It's cognate with that. Whereas Inch is the traditional old Gaelic one. So Inch or Inch is Inch. Inch Cailleach is the island of the old women, or in this case, of the women. But that Cailleach, that mother goddess, we will return to her in a couple of slides. We'll be talking about her a bit more as well. So Cailleach. So this word is Mian. Mian. This is probably the first example of a Gaelic word kind of causing a bit of havoc with our, I say, English-speaking eyes, because it looks like there's a D and an H in the middle of that, and I'm just going straight over them. I am, and that's a Gaelic, that's a rule of Gaelic orthography and a rule of Gaelic pronunciation, which we're not going to get into this evening. But people often complain about Gaelic. Oh, it's not written how it's spelled. It's written exactly how it's spelled. It does never break. It never breaks its own spelling rules whatsoever, and its pronunciation is very straightforward, with the caveat that you just have to learn that pronunciation. I argue it's more straightforward than English. English is renowned for breaking its own rules all the time, like is I before E, except after C, except there's more instances of that breaking its own rule than it follows its own rule. And words like trough and cough and thorough and borough and brow and all these sorts of things, that spelling doesn't quite make sense. In Gaelic, it follows its own rules all the time, but it takes a while to learn that. Anyway, this word mian means middle or central in some way. And it's corrupted itself in the name Ben Vain. I say it's corrupted itself. It's not corrupted itself, but it's been corrupted by cartographers who didn't speak Gaelic. So Ben Vain, the original Gaelic name for Ben Vain would have been Bain Evein. Bain Evein, which is the hill of the middle. Because the word mian, when it's in the genitive case, don't worry, not a grammar lesson tonight, we're not going to get into it. But when it's in the genitive case, it transforms from mian to vein. So Ben Vain is just a poor transliteration of the name Bain-Vein, probably done by an English-speaking cartographer during the time of, the Ordnance Survey map was first commissioned essentially to help stamp out Jacobites hiding across the Highlands, because those in the south of the British Isles didn't really know what the Highlands looked like. So the OS maps were first commissioned to essentially begin to get a better understanding of that. So believe it or not, the British military were not that interested in preserving Gaelic orthographic conventions, and rather they just wanted to know what's the name of that big mountain and is there a Jacobite hiding under it. So that's where we end up with words like Ben Vain. And then later editions of the OS maps and the OS name books, they got better and better at preserving names. And in fact, we're really grateful to them. It's such an amazing source, the OS maps, having all of these these names that have essentially come to be forgotten, particularly in places where Gaelic isn't spoken so much. Anyway, back onto the word. The word is mian. Mian. Stop. Some of you might be saying that to me at this point. You've got too much Gaelic in your head, you're just saying stop. That's not what I'm saying. This word is stop. S-T-O-P. Stop. A broad but pointed peak is how I've defined it. And again, third time I'm saying it tonight, I'm not a geologist, I really am. But previous sessions like this, I've been reliably informed by a geologist that the name Stop often appears when you have something called crag and tail geology. Don't ask me to define that. There may be someone in the chat that can define that. But it seems that this sort of horseshoe of hills that I've screenshotted from near Crianlarich, this is apparently a really classic example of crag and tail geology producing this sort of hill, and we can see that in the Gaelic names as well. So we have Stop Binion, Stop Coranlochin, Stop Garav, and Stop Coravuye. So the name Stop is appearing over and over, when we might just consider them to be mountains, to be Bain something. But evidently their shape was unique enough that the Gaels wanted to give them a particularly different name, Stop. And in fact, on this same map, you can see how plentiful it is in Gaelic words. And Bialoch Etergavain, that's north of Stopinian there. That's a tautology, but within Gaelic, because Bialoch we know is a pass between mountains, and Etergavain means between two mountains. So it says the pass between two mountains, between two mountains. So even the Gaels were guilty of tautologies as well. But they wanted to make it very clear that that was the Bialoch, that was the passing point. So that word for a final time is stop. Botach. Okay, on to the botach. Meaning an old man. And the botach in traditional Gaelic Celtic belief was the other half of the cailleach. So the cailleach was responsible for storms and winter and nature and fertility and growth and all these sort of things. And the botach was responsible for law and order and society and essentially the rules of man, which may sound somewhat old-fashioned or chauvinistic, but actually the point of that belief system was that it doesn't matter what the botach, the old man, puts kind of arranges. The old woman has the power, or nature has the power to destroy it all. So that's the cailleach and the botach. But this map screenshot I've chosen here, this is a great interesting one of Glean Cailleach, meaning the glen of the old woman. And there's a site in there called Tynan Botach, which people in the chat might be familiar with if you know this area. So at the top end of Glen Lyon, this site here is the site of the longest continuously observed pre-Christian tradition in the British Isles. So every Beltane, every 1st of May, the people of Glen Lyon march all the way up the glen to this little sort of stone miniature house that's covered in grass and turf. And they bring out these river carved figures out of the house and they place them in front of the house. And those figures are meant to represent the botach and the cailleach and their children. And then every Samhain, every 1st of November, they march back up the glen and they put the cailleach and the botach and the kids back into the house for winter. And this is part of the sort of traditional votive offering system, which was what was used to kind of to appease the old Celtic gods before the culture was entirely Christianized. But that still happens every year, and I think it's happened every single year since its inception. So it's really interesting to know that that happens. But it's quite a commitment to go up the glen and go and do that. Anyway, that word there is botach. Okay, this word should be easy for anyone that's done half a day on Duolingo. Bake. Bake. Simply meaning small. That G is more like a K. Bake. And on the map here, it's showing on this place name, Trossachs Vake. That's like the word bake, but it's got an H in it. That's something called lenition that we do in Gaelic just to show that the previous word is feminine. Again, don't worry about it. If you see something resembling that word, you know that it means small. Bake. So you can guess what's coming next. More. More. So this is obvious in Ben More, and that's quite a common name. There's Ben More in Assynt, there's Ben More in Mull, there's Ben More here, there's Ben More down in Cowell. More, quite easy to pronounce. It's just that classic Scottish rolled R with a long O. More. We often see this as well. You see it on shop names and restaurant names and things like that. They'll add an H in. That only happens when it follows a feminine word, so it can look a little bit strange on its own when we see it like that, but that's just kind of people with not a total understanding of Gaelic grammar, which is excusable. But when you have an H in it, it transforms the M into a V sound, V. So it would be vor rather than more. But they both just mean big or large or great. More. Brech. We chatted about this a bit earlier. Bain Vrech. So Brech is it's a Gaelic poet's get out of jail free card because you can use it to describe a whole host of things you find in the Highlands, including treacles and trout and salmon and tartan and dappled hillsides. It's all that sort of mixed, patterned, dappled colouring, speckled essentially, which you can see on the side of the trout. Trout are renowned for being speckled, hence brech. So brech. Anyone read Kidnapped, you'll remember the culprit that shot Callan Campbell was Alan Brech Stewart. So that was freckled or pocked Alan Stewart. That was his name, pockmarked Alan. Brech. Giar. Giar. Short or cut off. Now, a fairly complicated description is going to follow for Gaelic Head, so I hope you're all still paying attention and no one's fallen asleep at their screens there. Gaelic head I chose as an interesting example because we see that place name elsewhere, but just in a different form. So Gaelic head this comes from the Gaelic, Ciaun a Yerloch, the head of the short loch. And it is a very short loch, Gairloch. So that Gair is Giar. But it's been anglicised, Gairloch head. So we have the English word head in there. If we were to fully anglicise it, it would be the head of the short lake. But it's only been partly anglicised just because there's a little bit of English influence in there. Gairloch head. We have the exact same name up near me, as I was saying, near Oban. There's an estate called Kingairloch, Ciaun a Yerloch, the head of the short lake. But rather than head, it's Ciaun. So it's the same name, but because we're going 100 miles northwards, more into core of Gaelic territory and away from the sphere of English language influence, it hasn't been changed to the same extent with Gairloch head. So it's really interesting. Through place names, we can track where different languages are beginning to influence the place names we have. Slightly convoluted, but I hope that explanation made some sense. Yeah. Okay, so that word again is Giar. The photo I've chosen is not of a particularly short mountain, but this is Giar Unoch, one of the three sisters of Glencoe. Giar Unoch. Fata, Fata. Look, it's pronounced much how it's spelt, except rather than a D, it's a big fat T. Fata. Put your tongue behind your teeth. Fata. And Inchfad, that's another great example of Inch Fata, the Long Island. It's not particularly long, but compared to Inchcailo, it is. Right, I'm rushing through these because we've got a couple pages to go through before we get on to the interactive bit. And I really want to because I can see your questions, your challenging questions piling up in front of me. Yeah, this is the last one we'll look at. Arsht, or Ard, Arsht. High or tall place, or it can also mean a promontory onto water, but probably not in this case. So Ard Louis is Arsht Lui, the height of the calf. Calf is a cow's calf. Arsht Lui. So high place, Arsht. And you can pronounce it Ard if you're from Lewis, or Arsht if you're from anywhere else. But the Lewis pronunciations may be a bit easier. I don't think anyone is from Lewis, because you would have said when I asked in the chat earlier. Okay, quick look over the colours, and I won't go through these, but I wanted to show you this mainly to draw your attention to the fact that different languages break up the colour spectrum in different ways, depending on what's generally more plentiful in their natural environment. So a really interesting one for us is down in the bottom line here. You can see this word gorum, G-O-R-M, gorum, and I've described it as being blue or green. Now, as far as we are concerned, as English language speakers, those are two entirely distinct colours. You can't really mix them up. And if you were to, you'd consider it turquoise or teal. But that's not what this word is referring to. So, I mean, you might not be able to see my camera, but my shirt's got a bit of gorum on it, this, objectively blue colour. But gorum can also be used to describe really flourishing grass or trees, that bright, luscious green colour. So Isla, for example, Isla's bardic name is Ile Goraminor, blue Isla of the kind of luscious grass. So to describe something as luscious and flourishing and looking really healthy and natural, you can say Goram. What we would know as a vibrant, verdant, lush green, we use the same word we use for blue. And it's just a case of the colour spectrum being broken up in a slightly different way. Above that one, we have another word that's really useful in Scotland is ruag. Ruag. Rusty red. And its probably most common application is when we're talking about people with, as we say in English, red hair or ginger hair. That hair colouring that is difficult to describe in English. It's not difficult to describe in Gaelic. It's specifically this colour, ruag, rusty red, which we see all across our hillsides in bracken and in foliage, but also is such a common hair colour in Scotland and in Ireland. So ruag is this rusty red, this sort of ginger or red-headed colour. So that's a quick look over the colours, but just to give you a bit of a taste of it. Because I want to get on to the really challenging stuff, of course, before I hand over to yourselves. Now, very quick grammar lesson, but don't worry, it's the easy way because we're going from Gaelic to English. We're not trying to teach you Gaelic grammar, which again is very straightforward once you learn it, but there's a lot to learn. There's I think there's 15 definite articles in Gaelic, whereas in English we have one, which is the. We have 15 ways of doing it. We're not going to look at those 15. But all of these little pink blobs here, these are ways that this can appear in Gaelic names. So you'll probably have seen this if you've looked at Monroe names or even just village names or looked at a map for any time. You'll have seen these little connecting words in the middle of a name. So you'll have seen something, and then one of these, and then something. It'll make sense on the next page. All you need to know when you see these little connecting words is all they mean is off or off the. That's it. So it's just a little connecting word, off or off the, connecting two nouns. To make that a bit clearer, I'll show you the next page. So here's an example where these little connecting words are appearing. In the case of this first one on the top, Stúch a Chráin. This is a Monroe above Loch. Stúch a Chráin. So this is made up of three words. Stúch, which we can just look up in the dictionary, meaning sharp peak. The last word is Chráin, which we can look up in the dictionary, just however it appears in the name, and we can find out that means damage. Because it says in the middle, we don't need to look up don't need to think about what that means. We can just assume the middle word means off the. So this is Stúch a Chráin, sharp peak of the damage. Why it's called that, I don't really know, but at least we can translate its name. So that's all that's doing, is just off the. Second example down below, Corrie na Banchirna. Now I can look up the word Corrie in the dictionary and find out it means Corrie, or we know that already. Banchirna means a lady, as in like a noble lady, the wife of a lord, essentially. But we don't need to look up now, it's fine, because we know always that this middle word just means off the. So, Corrie na Banchirna, Corrie of the lady. Hopefully that makes sense, and it's a little shortcut for when you're deciphering Gaelic names. One last wee thing I'll mention on this is you'll notice that the full names, like Stúch a Chráin, that Chráin is written completely differently to how I've got Cron on the left-hand side. Don't worry about that. The online dictionary that I'm going to point to you at the end is really great because no matter what form you put the Gaelic word into the dictionary, it can take it all apart and it will just give you the original word, the word that you're looking for. So that's one thing that can complicate people, is that Gaelic words have different cases and tenses and they change. Don't worry about that, because no matter how you find the word, you can put it in the dictionary and it will give you it in an accurate way. So yeah, this is the last wee thing I want to look at before handing over to you, and I'll make sure in these 5 minutes to do a bit of chat at the end. Perhaps Kathy, we can maybe come back onto the recording, or yeah, just keep it recording, and then we can do the final 5 minutes of chat. Or Tara, I can't remember which one of you was looking after it. Anyway, yeah, I wanted to show you this. So this sort of thing that we'll do together is we'll do a bit of deciphering of the place names around you. Just show you some of the interesting names you can find. So this was a genuinely random 8-kilometre square I found in the middle of the Trossachs, just as an example as to how we can work out what the place names mean. So this fairly random one, I mean, it looks like there's names here that look like they come straight out of a Scott novel, and we're in Scott country around here. But this one at the very bottom, you've got Crichen in Amir Glash. And you can look up every single word in the dictionary there, except for because we know what means, it just means off there. And that means the crags of the grey, green, flourishing pool. How gorgeous is that? And it's just a random little place name just on the side of Ben Venue, or Ifein Venev, as we say in Gaelic. Then you've got Dreimn and Sassenach, Ridge of the English, Galoch na Mo, Pass of the Cattle, Corrin na Urishkin, Corrie of the Fairy Spirits, Imprison, the prison, Faith na Caliche, the old woman's bog, might just be some old woman, or it might be the Cailleach, Fear Glachkin, the crooked catchment, and the sitting rock, Clachan Tuya, which is the sitting rock. And the final really interesting one I found, and this is conjecture, so take this with a pinch of salt, but Skia na Muchgandua, flank of the Black Pigs. We know that Gaels lived alongside wild boar for centuries before they hunted them to extinction in the 1600s. So I'm wondering, is this a reference to that? We do have a Gaelic word for boar, which is torc, but is that what the Muchgandua are? Are they wild boar? And in fact, there's evidence through place names of wild boar living in this part of the world, and that's just been kept alive through linguistic evidence. This is the sort of thing that I love looking at through place names, some of the discoveries you can make. And there's one I'll talk about oysters if we get back to it, if anyone's interested in hearing about oysters. But I will leave the slide section of this because I want to leave us time. We do have a good bit of time to answer some of your questions. So I'll stop sharing and we can maybe jump onto a dictionary or on a map. But in the meantime, I will look at the Q&A and see if I can get through a few of the questions we've got. I think I've answered most at the top. Why were Norse place names retained in the Hebrides when it is a stronghold for Gaelic? Yeah, it's really interesting. So when we have the Norse, the Norse invasion, when the Norse settled the Western Isles, that would have probably coincided with the same time as Gaelic speakers arriving in. So it would have been a little bit of a the Gaels wouldn't necessarily have been settled too long in there before their place names were essentially entirely overwritten by their Norse rulers, who were there for approximately 400 years at best. So really, the essentially all of the original place names we have in the Western Isles would have been Norse, all of the significant ones. So that's why when you look at places like Callanish and Carloway and Uig and Bernary and all of these, they all root in Welsh, particularly when you see ending in nish, Ullinish and Hushinish. All of these are Norse in origin. The way they were retained was essentially the Norse were not then cleared out of the Western Isles. The Norse essentially became assimilated into the Gaelic lordship of the Isles. So the Viking Age declined, I think, around about the 13th century. And the Viking Age internationally and also in Scotland, and the lordship of the Isles declined probably about 200 or so years later. So the Vikings were essentially, the Norse were essentially assimilated into this Gaelic kingdom. So it was a half and half Norse Gaelic kingdom for a good couple hundred years. And Michael Newton's book that I talked about, Warriors of the Word, is really good on that. But that's part of the reason that then, as Gaelic orthography and Gaelic literacy was developed, they then essentially took on these place names that were established by Norse speakers, and they took them into being part of their Gaelic heritage. The same way that us as English speakers, we've taken in Gaelic place names to be part of our English heritage. We've changed Upperfoyle to be Aberfoyle because it suits our English language orthography. We haven't booted out these Gaelic names and replaced them with English ones. We haven't said mouth of the River Foyle. We haven't changed the name of Aberfoyle to that. We've kept it, but just followed our own English orthography. Hopefully that answers your question. Would Gorum also apply to bluebells and the more purple end of blue? Great question. And I wasn't actually too certain about this until recently. The word we use for purple is purpy, which is quite clearly a loan word from English. And so I thought, why on earth do we not have a word for purpy? Because purple appears naturally in the natural environment. You get heather. But it seems that there's a word in Irish that's gone out of fashion in Scottish Gaelic just due to probably greater Anglicisation, which is corcera or corcoran. And I don't know whether it's related to the surname Corcoran, but corcera is this word for kind of traditional purple. The way that, not to sound too morbid, and if you're a bit squeamish, don't listen to this, but they say the way your blood looks when you look at your veins, the sort of bluish purpley thing, that's corcera. And then fresh blood, if you've just been cut, is jerak, which is red, and then as it dries, it's ruig. That's the way of remembering the different colours of blood. Why on earth you need to do that, I don't know. But corcera is that word. So I think cork is what you use for bluebells, but in Gaelic we don't call them bluebells, we call them brach na cuaige, which is cuckoo's shoes, because they arrive at the same time as the cuckoo does, and the cuckoo's getting ready for spring, so he's got on his good fancy shoes. History of the place name Conanish. Near Kendrum, yeah. Conanish. Now that you say it, I don't have a clue, because nish usually indicates a promontory, and it's a Norse suffix, but Conanish is about as far inland as you can get. I would assume the con part of it is probably dog, relating to dog. Conanish. I haven't got a clue off the top of my head. If I get a chance, I will look in the book, and if not, I'll keep a note of these questions that I haven't particularly answered, and I'll hopefully get those answers to you afterwards. But I'm going to recommend a book that should have the answer in it anyway when we go through this. An amazing translated map, thank you. Is there a map of the whole park with translated place names? There's not, and to be honest, I actually wouldn't recommend doing that. It was fun. It's really fun to do. The danger of doing that is you actually end up doing exactly what I was just talking about, which is you may end up booting out the original place name if you just learn what it means. I would say it's more important to equip everyone with the skills to know Gaelic, and so then they can just read it rather than translating it. That may be controversial, so I apologise if that's the case, but there's a real danger of that. Some organisations have changed the names of really popular walking sites to the English translation, and through influencer culture and what have you, the name of the place has then been changed in the common chat, which happens. That languages evolve, they change, but we don't need to necessarily hurry it on when we're trying to protect a minority language like that. Ellie, does Thai mean house? Spot on, it does. And that actually takes me on to someone else was saying they were in just moving to Tyne Drum soon. So I can finally put to bed the question of, is it Tyne Drum or Tyndrum? It is not Tyndrum. And people say they've heard locals sing Tyndrum, and it's not Tyndrum. It is Tyne Drum. That's because it comes from house, house of the ridge. Tyne Droma, Tyne Droma, Tyne Drum. So apologies if I've offended anyone with my pronunciation of Tyne Drum, but it's not Tyndrum, it is Tyne Drum. Brig o Turk. I'm going to look this one up, and that's a good point, Andy. I'm wondering, are you picking up on that because I said Tork, which is boar. Brig o Turk, does it refer to that? It might well do. I'm going to look at it really quickly and see if I can find an answer. Because as I say, I know this stuff, and I look at this sort of stuff all the time, but it's difficult from absolutely everything. And every single time I open this book that I'm going to talk about in a bit, I learn something new. Brig o Turk, Brig o Turk. I'm sure this is very Brig o Turk. The English name mentions the Turk or Boar River. Well, hey, Andy, fantastic. Good bit of forensic place name knowledge. Yeah, that's really interesting. The Gaelic name is Bridgend, Drossachs, which obviously has sort of been lost over years. In Gaelic, this place is also... I won't go into that. But yeah, you're spot on. That may corroborate my theory of Skia na Muckendua. Andy, you and I shall publish a paper on the porcine place names of the Trossachs. Thank you for that. Bit of an argument about Glendaruel. The most common story is River of Red Blood after Bloody Red to the Vikings. Kate, I was actually speaking to a relation of mine from Trossachs about this the other day because I didn't have a clue. So Glen da Ruel, Glen is just a glen. Da is of two things, so it's a glen of two things. And the Gaelic for it is Ruel. Ruel, we often pronounce it in Argyll. We miss over the middle of words sometimes. We're in a rush. And that means little red things. However, it seems that is a corruption of a saintly person of some sort, some goddess type person called Jerica, which is kind of redness, the red great thing. And over time, that seems to have been changed to another way to say the red person. So Glen da Ruel seems to originate in the name for some holy person whose name is associated with the colour red. There's a better explanation in this book, Placenames of Scotland, that I'll talk about. But these sorts of stories about red blood, there's the exact same thing with the Vikings. Here in Argyll, on the String of Lorne, there was a battle, and the river is called Alt Jerak, the Red River, because it ran red with blood after the battle. So it's a common sort of thing. Any idea about your home? Arsht Hjarnvik. Yeah, if I had to guess, I can't actually write in the chat, but Arsht Hjarnvik is probably how you'd say in Gaelic today. Arsht, the height or the promontory, if it pokes out onto water of some sort, you could let me know. The height, a Hjarn is a little corner of some sort. We say in Scotland, we say in Gaelic, Asgach Hjarni, from every corner of the world, Asgach Hjarni. And big is just small. So the height of the little tucked away corner, potentially, is Arsht Hjarnvik. Could be something else. There's every chance that that's been corrupted, but that's the most obvious one, I thought. Can you suggest a source of help with pronunciation of Gaelic words? Are there some basic rules? I'm a bit familiar with Welsh, where once you understand how certain letters are pronounced, it's possible to at least make an attempt, but Gaelic seems much more complicated. Yes, I will. When we return to the screen, the presentation after this sort of interactive section, I'll show you my recommended sort of Gaelic learning journey. And that's unfortunately the best answer I can give you, which is just getting to grips with the language. I think if you were to attempt to just learn the orthography, I think that would end up being kind of a hollow effort because it wouldn't necessarily stick if you're not then also learning the kind of what I call it, the semantic nature of the words at the same time. A good basic rule of thumb for Gaelic words and for most Gaelic place names as well, take it with a pinch of salt, is we always put the emphasis on the first syllable every word in Gaelic. There's not a word, as far as I can think of, where we put the emphasis on the second syllable. So I'm trying to think of Gaelic words just now, and all I'm seeing is words that... Korak. Your finger is your korak. It's not your corag. It's always your corag. Or your garstin, which is your arm, is your garstin, not your garstin. What's a Gaelic place name word? Avin. River is Avin. It's not Avin, it's Avin. So we always put the emphasis on the first syllable. And that's a great rule of thumb when you're going in with Gaelic place names. Although a lot of the time Gaelic place names end up being 3 words mashed together, so you have three terms of emphasis. Maeve, any idea why would Horn be named after a cairn when most hills have a cairn, or is it maybe something else? Yeah, I don't have an idea. Beyond perhaps it is particularly Carnoch, particularly rocky and rough. I'm not 100% sure where Horn is. There's a something a Horn in Rathi. It could also be something else. I would be inclined. Yeah, I'll actually use this as an excuse to look in the dictionary in a minute when I come back to your questions and show you how the dictionary works, because it can throw up various different meanings. The word botoch, for example, is ridiculous. The word for old man, it has 100 different words that have nothing to do with old men. One of the definitions of botoch is a 3-legged device used to keep a peat creel on one's back. It's like, how often does that come up in everyday conversation? I don't know, but people would know you're not talking about an old man. I read it somewhere, possibly, this is Andy's question, possibly Michael Newton's book on Lennox and Menteith. Oh, sorry, you're answering me, Spawn. Thank you. One time for start. Fiona, have some place names been shortened? Yes, they have. That shortening is coming through an attempt to bring the Gaelic word into English language orthography. So, ach so what you've written there, achig, A-C-A-D-H, achig. That's the full way that we would write it. But if you're telling that to a non-Gaelic speaking cartographer, which would have been the case in the 1700s, you would have said achig to them, and they would have written down, okay, ach a charn bik. So it's a simplification of it. We have that with Benderloch. I don't know if anyone knows the area of Benderloch, just north of Oban, but it in Gaelic is really clear. It's Bain Etter Da Loch, mountain between 2 lochs, because that's exactly what the area of Benderloch is. It's a hilly area, and you've got Loch Cretan to the north and Loch Etive to the south. And so it's clearly Bain Etter Da Loch. But again, if you go back 150, 200 years and you ask a Gaelic-speaking crofter and you're an English-speaking cartographer, what's the name of this village? They say, oh, Bain Etter Da Loch. You say, oh, Benderloch. So that's where these place names come from. You get these shortenings, and that's part of the fun, is then trying to work it back out and work out what the place name was. Ellie, what does Ardnamurachan mean? Yeah, great one. There's two possible answers to it. Arsht, we remember, is promontory, so that's really obvious. Obviously, in Ardnamurachan, the whole thing is a promontory. It sticks out into the ocean. Num, we know num, that's off the, or na is off the. The Murachan part could be 2 different things. So it could be Mor Huan, which is big seas, great seas, makes perfect sense. Arsh and the Murachan, the height of the big seas. If you've been at the Murachan Lighthouse in a storm, you see that that's got big seas. But it also could be an old word for seal, which is Murchan, which is sea dogs. Murchan, the point of the sea dogs. And you get every likelihood you get sea dogs around there. Now, some additional conjecture from me, which worked on the last point when Andy proved me right, or rather helped confirm my hypothesis about the Torc, about the boars. We call orcas today in Gaelic, we call them Matig Cuin or Mati and Cuin, which is essentially sea dog. It's the same thing, sea canine. So potentially was Murchan an old word for orcas as well? Not too sure. Again, potentially just conjecture. I'm going to answer Soraka's question. That's the last question I'll ask before I go into the last wee thing, but you will have a contact for me afterwards. And if I deliberately skipped over your question, I promise I didn't deliberately, unless it was really difficult. But you can ask me an email and I can get the answer to you. See lots of places around Loch Lomond called Town, such as Town in Eanan or Town in Clack. Really simple, it's a small little hillock. And it's more common in Stirlingshire and Perthshire and Argyll, where we get lots of little hillocks. Town, pronounced town, not Tom. Town. Great. That was a whistle-stop tour of folks' questions. And I will now share my screen again and show you a couple of pages. Right, you should be seeing that again. Yeah, spot on. So I'm going to go over this. Don't quite have time for it, I'm afraid. So these are three first things I would recommend. So this is the book I've been referring to over and over. The Placenames of Scotland. That is the best £7.99 you will ever spend in your life. I bought mine, don't know how many years ago, but it has been well leafed. It's my Bible. Keep it in the dashboard of your car, and every time you go through a new village, pull over to the side of the road very safely, and then get the book out and find out what that village means. Because it's got really small settlements in it, as well as loch names and river names. Really great. Reading the Gaelic Landscape by John Murray. This is sort of a much deeper deep dive on what we've covered over an hour and a half. The same sort of content, but really breaking it down and probably going into more minute detail on a lot of things that I might have glossed over. So recommend that. The dictionary is fachler.com. There's a few dictionaries. I personally like this one. Little caveat with it, its Trossachs or graves often go what I would call the wrong way. We've kind of changed Gaelic spelling in the past 30 years, and some people prefer to stick with the older ways. For our purposes, we're not trying to be fluent Gaelic speakers in this group. We're attempting to decode place names. It's great because it's got two dictionaries within it. One of them particularly looks at much older archaic terms, which are really common in place names. So I recommend this dictionary, but not for learning Gaelic. It's my caveat. It's great for place names, not for learning Gaelic. This possibly sort of answers someone's question about learning the pronunciation. 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I couldn't have pointed you to an actual Gaelic learning journey that's pretty much guaranteed to bring you from zero to hero, nothing to fluency. Now there is a really clear journey you can make in Scotland if you want to become a fluent Gaelic speaker. It takes time and commitment and investment, but it's possible. So I recommend to everyone start out on Duolingo. Just gets you used to the words, gets you used to the sound of it and the spelling rules, and a lot of the cultural aspects as well. So I recommend Duolingo. Speak Gaelic then is a little step above that, or you could go straight in and Speak Gaelic. It's a multimedia course, meaning there's podcasts, there's face-to-face classes, there's textbooks, there's online learning games, kind of like Duolingo. There's a TV show, there's all sorts. And the great thing is the content's the same all across it. So if you can't make class that week, it's fine. Just chuck on a podcast and it's probably discussing the same stuff you would be chatting about in class in a fun, informal way. And then the three bottom things here, in Cursor Injugi, in Cursor Earthish, and in Cursor Comish, these are going in ascent, well, as they descend, they're in ascending order of commitment and difficulty, but they're Gaelic classes hosted by Salma Rustic, the National Centre for Gaelic Language and Culture Excellence in the Isle of Skye. And the first two are at a distance, so fairly low commitment, but a couple times a week. And then the bottom one is, yeah, really recommend it. It's 9 months, one academic year, on site in Skye, immersed fully from day one. You will not use English in your classes. It's all fully immersive. And after that, you will be highly fluent, considering how little effort you have to put into it. And I know that's maybe not a pipe dream, but unrealistic for a lot of people's living situations. However, the other two courses will get you really far in terms of learning, developing your Gaelic. That is my last slide. I've got 3 minutes left, and I'm going to use those 3 minutes, if that's okay, to quickly show you this dictionary and how Fachler works. So what was the word? Someone was asking, let me have a quick look. Someone was asking about, there was a word. Goodness, I can't remember what it was, and I'm sorry about that. But I will show you an example of, so let's see, we're on the OS map. Let me zoom in randomly. I've zoomed in on the cobbler. There we go. Right, there's a word. So Bialoch, we know that one. That's pass. We know that's off there, but we don't know what this word means. Van. I don't know what that means. So I'm going to put that in just as it appears. Van. Enter. I've got mine in Gaelic, but let me put it in English for you. Van. Search. Right, so it's given me a few ones. Now, I know for a fact that it's not the first one or the second one. Annoyingly, it's given me it down at actually it's not the third either, it's given me the fourth option, so perhaps I chose a dead example. However, you could probably look at these answers that it's given you and recognize, yeah, it's probably not talking about a hernia on the side of Benin, more likely talking about a rounded hill, mountain gap pass, or a boil or bulge, essentially. But as you can see, the word, the way it's spelled it is just M-A-M, which is different to how I put it in. I put in M-H-A-M. That's because M-H-A-I-M is the genitive form of the word, but man is the base form, and the dictionary is smart enough to reverse engineer it. Hopefully that's enough time to show you that, but this is what I mean in terms of equipping you with the ability to go on yourselves. So I recommend you go and look at your area, go and get an OS map out of the drawer, look at your area and find what Gaelic names there are, and start chucking words into the dictionary, and you can begin to find them out. With that fairly rushed end, I'm sorry, it's purely because your questions were very good and very, very challenging as well. I'll bring that webinar to an end. But I hope you've gotten something out of that. And again, I'll make sure that between the team at the national park, you'll be able to get in contact with me. You also can find me on Instagram. So if you wake up in a cold sweat 3 years from now at 4 in the morning and you desperately need to know what Bialach means, you can get in touch with me. So tá live san sin more and time agus an dochas gun the chóstreif. I hope it enjoyed you. I hope you enjoyed it. Sorry, I was translating Gaelic back into English in my head. I hope you enjoyed it. More than time, guys.